Okay, hello, welcome everyone. Today is our final Reading Villanova for the semester, so we're going to be talking about diversity. Unfortunately, Dr. Katia can't join us, but that's okay. So we're going to start with having each of you introduce yourselves and the work that you do.
Hi, I'm Brighid Dwyer. I have many roles on campus. I teach in communication, education, where else? Communication, what? Youth and justice, oh, excuse me, thank you. Continuing studies, or professional studies, so this is called. And so my work really is both administrative and research is really all tied around the same ideas of justice and really thinking about access to college and also making sure that students have good experiences when they're in college. And so a lot of the research that I've done has looked at different educational settings, so specifically looking at minority-serving institutions, so looking at historically Black colleges and universities, as well as Hispanic-serving colleges or Hispanic-serving institutions, and tribal colleges with it as well. And so looking at the ways in which those particular institutions also help to provide access to students who have been historically underrepresented in college. And then also looking at access to college issues just sort of more broadly. And I can talk more about that later, but I'm going to pass the mic over.
Hi, I'm Katina. I'm a professor in the psychology department, and I'm specifically in the Human Resource Development graduate program. And my research is sort of focused on two areas. So I have two research groups in my lab. One of the groups I'll talk about more today than the other. So I have one that's on negative workplace behaviors, which is mostly on envy in the workplace and abusive supervision and basically bad things that happen at work, and that sometimes has something to do with diversity. But the diversity side of the lab, the diversity group, is studying a lot surrounding the LGBT community right now in the workplace, both from a discriminatory perspective and what the impact of discrimination on LGBT populations at work is, but also from the perspective of examining what we can do to create actively positive environments. So instead of just avoid discrimination, don't discriminate against people, what can we do to actually create active, positive, inclusive environments? And a lot of folks haven't done work in that area just yet, so that's something that I'm looking at. And I guess another relevant piece to our conversation today, I'm also doing a large-scale qualitative study right now on victims of human trafficking and their transitions back into the workplace. So I've been conducting that study now for almost 2 years, and I've been volunteering in the residential home where the women are being rehabilitated for 4 years now prior to starting the research project. So that's something we can get into in a little bit. And then finally, I guess another relevant project would be a project that I'm doing, qualitative project on executives, specifically male executives who have been very supportive of female executives throughout their careers. So again, this idea of understanding and endorsing positive behaviors as opposed to teaching people just to avoid negative behaviors, or training women and minorities how to navigate hostile workplaces instead of teaching people how to navigate hostile workplaces. Instead, being able to train people on how to create actively inclusive workplaces so that we don't have to train people on how to navigate bad ones anymore. So that's what I'll talk about.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Camille Burge. I'm a professor in the political science department. I study political psychology and racial and ethnic politics. So the psychological theories that I usually focus on deal with emotions. So I study how we experience emotions as members of groups and how that might lead to changes in policy opinions and political behavior. My book project that I'm working on right now is titled Fired Up, Ready to Go, The Effects of Group-Based and Intergroup Emotions in African American Politics, where I study how African Americans experience pride, shame, and anger as members of their racial group, and how that leads to changes in policy opinion and their propensity to behave in the political arena. So whether or not they turn out to vote, whether or not they rally, or protest, or donate money, and what all these things mean. So that's one project that I'm working on now. The project that I sent to Dr. Katia to have you all read dealt with rallying around group identity, so really trying to understand what's going on right now with the Black Lives Matter movement. So I use a lot of survey experiments. So in this particular paper that I had you all read, We varied the race and victim of the perpetrator in a fictitious article about a murder and a subsequent arrest. And in the post, we asked questions about emotions and one's willingness to punish. So things about punitiveness, right? Does it matter what the race of the victim is and what the race of the perpetrator actually is, and how does that shape people's attitudes about whether or not we should punish? How does that also shape how they're feeling as members of their racial group? Another project that I have under review deals with prejudice and how both blacks and whites experience prejudice in different ways. So I can talk about that as well. And then when I'm done with the book in the spring, I have a research design that I'm hoping to kick out or study the field. And the title of this project is Whose Right to Bear Arms? Exploring the Role of Race and Attitudes About Gun Control, where I'm really interested in understanding whether or not it's really about everyone having the right to bear arms, or whether it's about certain people having the right to bear arms, and thinking about how this has worked historically, especially in regards to state constitutions prohibiting people of color from having weaponry, and what that even means now going from the Black Panther movement onto like present day with the NRA and the Second Amendment and what that might mean, right? So I can talk about that as well.
Thank you for introducing your work. Can you talk now about how your work relates to in an interdisciplinary manner and in a global arena? Because we are global interdisciplinary studies that started.
I can talk definitely about interdisciplinary studies. So as a political scientist, when you say you study political psychology, people are like, what? What is going on? This is a subfield in my major. And so the things that we do is that we take psychological theories from the wonderful people that study psych to try and explain political phenomena. So different things about like cognitive processes, motivated reasoning, emotions, all of these things that these wonderful people have been exploring for years. We take them and try and understand how we can apply them to politics. So I use research on group-based emotions and intergroup emotions, lots of the psychological stuff to inform what that might mean for politics. And on a global scale, I think at least I would hope that what I'm discussing might have something to do with intergroup relations and racial reconciliation, not only in the United States, but I also think this could be applied to in a universal context in regards to intergroup relations.
So I'll talk a little bit about this because I'm interdisciplinary by nature. So my background, I have a PhD in psychology, but also a PhD in women's studies. So I combined these two areas that actually when I was a graduate student, I'm an industrial organizational psychologist, which means that I study the impact of social psychology theory specifically in a workplace setting. And when I was about to embark on this dual PhD program, the folks in both psychology and women's studies were concerned about how that would work because no one had done that yet with a workplace focus. And so it seemed sort of counter to the women's studies department goals to be studying how to improve workplace productivity, for example. That's a fairly capitalist question to be asking. And so that was sort of in conflict with the women's studies department to some extent. And then the psychology department was sort of concerned about feminist methodologies and whether or not they would be up to snuff for the dissertation that I would have to put together because they were very heavily quantitative and women's studies tends to be very heavily qualitative. So as it turned out, there are only two programs that allow you to do a dual PhD in women's studies and psychology. One's at Penn State, one's at University of Michigan. I was in the program at Penn State, and no one so far out of either of the programs has ever done it with an IO focus yet, except for me, so I either say it was very smart or very stupid, because I'm the only person that has done so. But I'm very used to having part of the process of having half of your committee members when you're completing a PhD be in one discipline and the other half in another discipline is that you have to learn how to translate across disciplines why things are important. And so I find this to be a constant struggle in some ways with the work that I do because I have been trained to think about issues in society as broader than just here in one particular discipline. So for example, with this trafficking project that I have going on, a lot of people in the management and organization sciences and IO psych are like, what does trafficking have to do with organizations? Like, why is this interesting to anyone who's interested in organizations? And similarly, the folks on the women's studies side are like, yeah, trafficking is important, but why would you ever link it to organizations? Or what's important about solving trafficking from that perspective? And I think what I'm doing with the project that I'm working on is looking at how context can shape identity shifts for the individuals who have experienced trafficking. And so from an organizational perspective, we can learn about what are the contextual factors that play a role in taking someone who has a highly stigmatized identity and moving them towards feeling like they have a more empowered self-identity. And context has something to do with that. In this particular situation, it's an organizational context. And so that's the way that I'm writing the management paper out of the trafficking piece. But there are lots of other pieces that I'm going to write once I check the box of getting the management paper out that have much more to do with stories and storytelling that will resonate much more with the women's studies type audience. So I think that the way in which I work interdisciplinarily is that I have to make sure that my projects speak to multiple audiences, and that sometimes means turning one project into multiple projects that have different foci but are still utilizing the same data set or a different data set but the same data source. And so that's been tricky but also fun. I like the fact that a lot of people in graduate school told me not to do the dual PhD program, and it worked out just fine. So that makes me happy. And I think it can be a struggle to work interdisciplinarily, but I think it's worth it because it makes you a good translator. For all of you who are majoring in anything interdisciplinary, a very good thing to say on job interviews when you leave here is to say that you're a very good translator. You're able to make messages relevant to people across disciplines. You're not set in a particular jargon that people don't understand across disciplines, and you're able to really speak and communicate your messages well and strongly, regardless of who's in the audience, because you're aware of what will resonate with who. So I think that that's an important skill to keep in mind, and one certainly that's been beneficial to me.
Yeah, so similar to Katina, I have a background that is very interdisciplinary. So I did my undergraduate work in sociology, and then minored in education, and my my PhD is in higher education. And so education by its nature, I think, it heavily borrows from psychology and sociology. So I definitely have a lean towards sociology since that was my undergraduate major. But I think that there's a lot of influences and a lot of things, especially as we talk about the work that I do is looking at a lot of students' experiences in college. But so we have the individual student, which often we can think about that in terms of sociological context. We can think about that in terms of psychological context and where students are in terms of developmental stages of identity development, for example. That's actually one piece that I'm working on right now, is looking at students, how students who are attending Hispanic serving or emerging Hispanic serving institutions are understanding their own racial identity while the institution itself is also grappling with its own institutional identity. So what a Hispanic serving institution is, it's a university. All of them have different foundings, but a majority of them were predominantly white institutions. So one, for example, like Villanova, but because of demographic shifts, because of where they're located, particularly in the United States, they have a growing Latino population. And so once they reach a 25% marker, they're allowed to apply for federal funding and designation as a Hispanic serving institution. And so that different institutions are really grappling, as Katina was talking about, with this institutional identity. And so a lot of sort of the psychological things that she was just talking about, I definitely find in my own work as well. So thinking about how does an organization define itself? How does a college or university want to portray itself? So how are students going to receive that? So there's some really interesting information that I gathered by interviewing students about what their perceptions were of that. So a lot of that is wrapped up in where they are in their own identity development, as I mentioned, but it's also thinking about what their own racial identity is. So for example, one student who's African American and had considered attending a historically black college said, I chose this university specifically because I wanted a real life experience, a real world experience. Why would I go to a place that is going to be a Hispanic serving institution when I could have gone to an HBCU? So I think that's a very simplistic view of what the role and what the role of a Hispanic serving institution is. But there are these ideas that are out there in terms of what it means to be a student at a particular institution, how one is understanding one's own racial identity, and how an institution needs to grapple with what it means to be an HSI, because again, they can be different across the country, but what does it mean in that particular locale? Is it going to be positive in terms of gaining more students who have been historically underrepresented, who identify as Latina or Latino, and they're going to gain access to this institution because they heard the word Hispanic and they say, oh, that institution's for me, I can go to college. And so that's a benefit, but are we also going to lose some Black students who are going to say, that's not for me, and I don't want it to be for me because I have my own thing that's over here that I can have. And so I think really talking about how we communicate across difference, across our own understandings, is a lot of where I find myself. And so again, going back to while I'm trained in terms of these different disciplines, I see them coming out in the work that I'm doing. And so then if I transition to one of my other roles on campus, which is my main role being the director of the program on Intergroup Relations here, that's incredibly interdisciplinary. I mean, that's all we do. All of the people who teach in that department are from across the university. And so I think it's this perfect example of where we have, you know, somebody who's in math and somebody who's in peace and justice and somebody who's in history and just a variety of different perspectives coming together to have these conversations. And I think it's when we have this mix of people from different backgrounds that we really learn and we really grow. And I think that that's true in terms of discipline. I think that that's true in terms of, again, we're talking about diversity, so in terms of talking about racial identity, it's true in terms of talking about one's gender, sexual orientation, et cetera, and so on.
So even though this is put on by the Global Interdisciplinary Studies major organization, whatever, when I was reading all of your works, I could relate them to what's happening in the world today, what's happening on this campus this semester. So that includes protests around college campuses, including on our campus, issues with police brutality, arming the public safety, and the growth of the Black Lives Matter movement. So I was wondering if you guys could talk about, you all could talk about how your research plays into these issues that are happening today, and as well as how Villanova might be able to improve its diversity.
Okay. So my work does cover some issues related to race because almost everything that I do is intersectional, and so I have lots of participants from lots of different backgrounds in my studies, and I'm very cognizant of the fact that the differential layers of identity that those participants bring to the table can affect the experiences that they're having. And actually, one of the reasons that I do qualitative work, even if I have a quantitative study, I usually have a study one that's qualitative that I've based my quantitative data collection on, and the reason for that is because I think it's important to hear the voices of the people that you're working with so that you can understand whether or not there are differential challenges, and if there are, what are they for the people who are experiencing them. Particularly, I do a lot of work in the LGBT community, and particularly some studies that I've been working on in the transgender community, where transgender people of color's experience is just very, very different from transgender white people, and so it's also an experience that I do not have. I do not have the experience of being a transgender person of color, and so for me, having lots of conversations with transgender people of color and feeding that into the research project makes it resonate with the community much more, which is my ultimate goal, right? I want to impact the community. That's the reason that I'm doing this work, and so getting it right is important, and getting it right means really listening to and understanding the people that you're working with. And so the way that I see my work connecting with these larger issues, like the protests that have been happening on campus for a variety of different reasons, or other sorts of issues that are going on. I mean, we had an issue on campus around LGBT issues a little while ago, a couple years ago, and still I think have some ways to go with that community on campus in terms of being inclusive. And so I think one of the things that resonates with me is that listening and understanding and not being defensive on campus when somebody says my experience is not like your experience and here's why. I've seen in many classes where people will share that they've had differential experiences, and there's always a small group of students that are kind of rolling their eyes about, oh, there's that squeaky wheel person of color, there's that squeaky wheel gay guy or whatever talking about their experience and how it's so different from mine. And it's not a squeaky wheel. It's really somebody saying, you know, the model doesn't work for everybody in the same way. And people trying to highlight the places where it's not working. And we should listen to that, because if we don't listen to the places where it's not working, it'll never get any better. So I think that in a lot of ways my work resonates with that idea, because I like to give people a voice through my work. I'll give one more example about voice and the importance of voice. In the study that I'm doing on victims of trafficking, I have this woman in my study. So the women are in this year-long rehabilitation program, and many of them end up leaving before the program's over. So these women have been through like horrible atrocities, just terrifying things, and most of them have run away from home around the age of 11 or 12 and get picked up on the street by somebody. So it's not trafficking in the sense that these women are coming from different countries. They are actually almost all from Philadelphia. And they've run away from home and been picked up by someone who is actively prostituting women, and they become involved in drugs and alcohol, etc., and sort of get involved in that lifestyle. And some of the women, by the time they come to the house, have been living as a prostitute on the streets for 40 or 50 years. So some of the women we get are, you know, in their 60s, and they ran away from home when they're 11. And so I had this one woman who was in my study, a Black woman in her 60s, who that was basically her trajectory. And I interviewed her multiple times about her life story and what had happened to her and all the things that she had experienced, and just the vulnerability that was there from being a runaway woman of color who was young, and the exploitation that had happened to her during that period of time. Even some things that she didn't even realize were exploitations. She would talk about stuff like casually, like, oh, this is normal, this happens to everybody. What? No. And so I have all of her stories on voice recorder. She ended up leaving the house prematurely and going back to the streets, mostly because she was unable to find employment, which is some of the angle that I'm taking in the project. And it became overwhelmingly frightening for her to think about what would happen if she failed at this, and that it was probably easier for her to just disappear and go back to the street and not try, because trying and failing was better than just kind of disappearing without having attempted to go get a job and make it work and whatever. So she went back to the street, and we found out recently that she passed away, which was very upsetting for everybody in the project. And as I was working through being upset about the fact that she had passed away, it occurred to me that, like, I have her story on audio file. And given that she ran away at 11 and doesn't have close family or friends, I'm probably the only person who has that story. And there's a real responsibility in that, I think. And so I think that we all have a responsibility to really listen to one another, listen to the experiences that other people have had that are different from yours, because that's how we learn and get better. I think a lot of times when we see these reactionary folks on the positive side of, you know, that who have benefited from these systems that other people are making them aware of, and we see these reactions and defensiveness, it's a lack of listening that's keeping that the reason the protesters have to be so loud is because no one's listening, right? And so so for me, I think it's about giving voice, and I see the threads between that, even though my work isn't directly on protesting or movements or things like that. So anyway, that's my piece.
Right, how do you follow that one, right?
Wow. So I should talk a little bit just about my personal background and where I came from and how I became interested in studying like race. So I grew up in the suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia, a suburb called Alpharetta, Georgia, just down the street from Forsyth County, which in 1990 in the census had no Black people, right? So Oprah went to do a segment in Forsyth County many moons ago to speak to the people there. So the Klan is very active in this county where I grew up down the street from. And so one of the things that I always thought was fascinating was like, how do I navigate, you know, my African American identity in this predominantly Caucasian space, right? In my neighborhood, in my school, like, what do these things mean? And it wasn't until, I think, last year when I was on a Malcolm X panel, last spring sometime, I think with Professor Katina, that I even started to understand like how all of these things like fit together, right? How all of my experiences coming from the suburbs, I went to a historically black college for undergrad because I wanted to have that experience, to go and sit in a classroom where the professors looked like me, where I was surrounded by people that also looked like me. I went to Bethune-Cookman University for undergrad, and then for grad school I went to Vanderbilt. So I was back, in a PWI situation, and people were like, is this a different experience for you, going to Vanderbilt? I'm like, no, that's actually my entire life, living in Alpharetta. And so when I went to grad school, one of the things that I was really concerned with or interested in the racial and ethnic politics literature was about this concept of linked fate. So this idea was popularized by Michael Dawson, and so this construct suggests that what happens to one member of your group, if you are a member of that group, might happen to you. So the question says, do you think that what happens to one black person, for example, in the United States will have something to do with what happens in your life? Yes or no? If yes, will it affect you a lot, some, or not very much, right? So if you say yes and a lot, you have a very strong sense of linked fate, right? So a very strong sense of linked fate predicts your attitudes about welfare, about affirmative action, about black nationalist ideals, like naming your kids black names, sending your kids to black schools. It also predicts other things like turning out to vote. And so my initial research that I was going to focus on in the dissertation was about how one's racial identity or one's linked fate is dynamic, right? How this thing, how strongly connected I feel to my group, changes depending on the context. Right, so there might be some times in which I really strongly racially identify, and other times where I'm like, I'm not part of that group. I have nothing to do with those people acting crazy on the train on SEPTA, right? And so when I was telling this idea to Nick Valentino, he's a scholar at University of Michigan that came to visit Vanderbilt for a speaker series, and I had just gotten an NSF graduate research fellowship for this project. I was like, yeah, I just got funded from the NSF. This is a great idea. Nick Valentino very quickly shut me down, and he's like, so what are you going to do after you write this paper? This is one paper. This is not what you build your career on, right? So that, as a second or third year grad student, was a little life-shattering, because this is a top 5 scholar in political psychology, public opinion, behavior, telling me yeah, so you might want to adjust that a little bit, because once you figure this out, what's next for you? What's next? So after I had that meeting, I was like, whatever, Nick Valentino, I'm right, you're wrong. And then I was thinking about it, and I was like, maybe he is right. So maybe what I'm interested in is emotions, right? So maybe not this idea that linked fate is static or dynamic, but this idea that there are times in which I can feel really strongly connected to my group, or weakly or disconnected from my group, but that's not driven by linked fate, that's driven by how I might be feeling. Right, so it might be when I'm really proud of members of my racial group, I might really strongly identify, or when I'm ashamed of what those people are doing, I don't want to talk about it. So just think about the basketball team and psychology research, right? So if your team is winning, or football, we'll talk about basketball here, Villanova, you tend to say things like, we, us, and our, we're the greatest, our team is winning, we can beat anyone else. When those people lose, it's them, they, their, those folks that were there, right? So I really got into the pride and shame literature, especially in psychology, the group-based emotions kinds of stuff. And then anger was something else that I wanted to study as well, because in political psych literature, anger is a motivating emotion. So we know that when people experience anger, they're more likely to turn out to vote. Right, they're more likely to donate money to a candidate. So there's tons of research in political psych about the roles of anger and how that shapes political participation, but there was nothing that was talking about how members of minority communities experience emotions and how that translates into differences in policy opinions and political behavior. So here's my filling of the gap, that we're all looking for to produce some new knowledge to the body of literature. And so that's what I started doing, right? I was really interested in understanding how members of the African American community experience pride, shame, and anger, and how that shapes their engagement in the political arena. And it turns out that there was some really interesting stuff. So much like Katina, I use mixed methods. So I do focus group studies where I can hear people talk about these things, like how have you experienced emotions as a member of your racial group, and how did that shape your engagement in politics, in the 2008, 2012, even prior to. Right, and so my whole entire life story has shaped this research trajectory that I'm very interested in, as I'm understanding as I'm interested in understanding like why members of the community that I identify with, kind of why we feel the way we feel and what that might mean in the political arena. And so I think, you know, thinking about how this relates to like what's happening on this campus, we had our urgent conversation about race last December in the midst of everything that was going on. There were so many things like on Yik Yak that people, you know, sent pictures of. I was also teaching race in that particular fall, racial and ethnic politics in the U.S. And I think the first step to recovery is admitting you have a problem, right? And a lot of times in the United States, it's not just about listening to both sides, especially as it pertains to race. I think part of the issue is you have some people that are very unwilling to admit that there's even a problem as it pertains to race, prejudice, injustice, right? And so when there is that in the way, it almost makes progress seem impossible, right? Because if you're not even willing to admit that members of certain communities are treated differently, then there's no way you can understand why these protests are happening, right? Because you're not even at a place where we can have this conversation to talk about historically discrimination against African Americans or the relationship between the Klan and the cops and what that means and how that gets talked about to children of color and various families. You know, don't go outside after the streetlights come on. Like, there's a reason, for all of these things. So I think as it pertains to diversity at Villanova, I think much like the rest of the United States and the world, we need to first start by saying that there's a problem here and acknowledging that this is an issue, right? So we can say never forget 9/11, never forget the Holocaust, slavery, you should forget about that, right? Even though slavery and the way in which things shaped up afterwards, so I think there's this great quote by like Greer and Cobbs, and they say something about although slavery ended, the way in which we perceive communities of color, members of color, that hasn't changed, right? That lens has remained the same. And that's why, in their book, Black Rage, African Americans, especially in the United States, are angry because they're not treated equally. They're not treated as humans, right? But you have to be at a certain place to be willing to accept that. And I don't even think that as a university or even as a country that we're there yet. So I think we need to start by admitting that there's a problem. And then after that, we can work on what we can do to rectify the problem.
So, I'm trying to think of where to start. So I recently I read, well, I do a lot of reading on higher education institutions, and a lot of it is in journal articles, and a lot of it is also just through sort of daily emails and from the Chronicle, or I also get one from Diverse Issues inside higher ed. So I get a lot of these sort of daily news, you know, like a newspaper about higher ed education. So I've known from all this various kinds of reading that I've been doing, and you've all probably heard it too, that soon the nation will be a minority, right? And first of all, I don't like that terminology because we have this idea about minority, right? So to be a minority is to be less than, right? And that doesn't make any sense. So we're still saying, it's still the language that we're using to describe our country is still diminishing the experiences of those who are the majority, right? And still saying that it's a different experience and it's an experience that's less than. So most recently in the literature, it started to use the terminology of minoritized. So people who are minoritized individuals. So not people who they themselves are minorities and are less than, but people who have been actively put into a position where they are created and made to feel less than, right? And so I really like that terminology because I think it speaks nicely to the actuality of the position, and you're still kind of using the first part of the word, and so people kind of know what you're talking about. And so I've known that this trajectory is happening, and even if we look at education research and K through 12 sectors, it's over 50% of K through 12 is now students of color, right? So another term I've heard, which is striking. And then I think about my daily interactions and coming here to work every day, and it's kind of easy to just divorce those things, like, oh yeah, that's happening. But kind of like Camille said, that our own personal backgrounds and our own experiences and our own stories and where we previously are affect where we are today. And so I grew up in the Bay Area in California, and I went to school in Los Angeles for college. And so experiencing and growing up in an environment that is very, very, very racially diverse, it's perplexing to me that I feel like I'm now in a state where, not Pennsylvania, but I'm in a place where the experiences in which I grew up with feeling that diversity is so normal, and now I live in a place where it's not kind of the norm, that level of diversity is not the norm. To feel that I'm divorced from that is still something that I can't quite reconcile with. And I have difficulty with it. And recently I was reading another one of these news articles, and again, information I kind of cognitively know, but sometimes you read something and you read it differently and it hits you in a different kind of way. And so this particular article was saying that so again, gave you the context of K through 12 education. Presently, if we look at higher education, so college, over 50% of college students are students of color. Over 50%. At Villanova, we're about 25%, so we're about half that. Now, the 50%, which I think was more like closer to 59, if my numbers are correct, does of course include a range of different types of universities. So we are a private Catholic elite institution. That statistic the statistic of over 50% also is going to include community colleges, open enrollment types of institutions, online institutions. It's going to include something very different. But if we look at the demographic of students nationally and what the range of experiences students can be having in college might be, and we compare it to what it is here, that just hit me in a way that just kind of blew my mind and felt like, wow, this is not what I'm reading, and what I intellectually know to be true and what I'm actually experiencing is very different. And then the piece that really just kind of knocked it out of the park for me was looking at the statistic that said 95% of college presidents are white. And that statistic has remained unchanged for at least 2 decades, right? I mean, and probably before that it moved that 5%. So that just speaks volumes, right? Oh, and the other addition to that was that 75% of the faculties on college campuses are white. So we have this disproportionate representation in terms of race across the board that is happening. Again, even if we think about the most diverse college and university, that's going to be over 50%. Even, historically black colleges are going to be close, probably in the 90% black. Some Hispanic serving institutions are going to be well over, 50%. Even some that were founded as HSIs are well over 50% Latino. But then we have still, if we include all this range of institutions, leadership and faculty being disproportionately white and not representing the students. And that struck me in a way where I thought, yeah, this stuff that's happening nationally, it needs to happen. Like this, seeing this, reading this paper, reading this computer, and then seeing what's happening, I was like, yeah, that needs to happen. Because how else are we going to make that change? It's all of what you've said. It's how do we understand that voice? And we have the statistics, and we need that voice. And I think we live so much in our particular sphere that we come to know it as normal. And we don't have that broader context to know what else is out there and what else is possible. And so I think it's really thinking about these current events that keeps me grounded in the research that I'm doing and keeps it fresh and makes sure that it's contemporary. I think that when I was a doctoral student, I said, I'm not going to be a professor. I'm not going to do research and just have it sit on the shelf. No, that's not going to happen. I'm not even going to do research. And of course, here I find myself doing it. But I think that I've always been driven by the action component of research and really thinking about action research in that it's not something that you do and you publish in a journal and that was the action that you emailed it somewhere. But you use that information that's come out of that research and you've put it in action. You've not just taught, maybe you've taught it to somebody, but not necessarily just that. But you've created a program. You've linked people together. You've created coalitions, something that moves it forward. And so I see a lot of what's happening on college campuses across the board, that finally people are they're reacting to their stories and their personal experiences where they've had negative and heartbreaking and demoralizing and experiences where they maybe have shelled out tons of money for an education that they don't feel good about because they don't feel like they've been treated well at a particular institution. And I feel like those stories are finally being married with these statistics. And I think that that's where a lot of the power really comes in. And so I guess I'm just very excited by all of the energy that's out there. And again, as a higher education scholar, not just, you know, the energy that's out there about Black Lives Matter, but now that it's on college campuses, like yes, I'm so excited. Like, I mean, this is right at my alley. I'm thrilled about all this happening. So I'll stop it.
I just wanted to add one thing quickly, because I think it's two things, right? We talked about the defensiveness, and I think part of what needs to happen, I'm also very excited that these protests are happening, and people are, you know, I get so concerned about Villanova's culture being so polite, and what do we mean by that? What does polite really mean? And I get concerned about that being a value, because sometimes it means that, like, status quo, it gets confused with, like, not questioning the status quo, which is different to me than being polite. Like, I'm not going to slam the door in somebody's face, but I'll join a protest if it, like, those are not the same to me. So I think that's something that is interesting to me about the sort of the group of students that's resistant to these kinds of changes, that I'm happy that it's happening, but on one hand, I kind of wish that we could, like, build an essay about your thoughts about, like, the Black Lives Matter movement into, like, our admissions process or something, just so that I don't have to hear the things that I hear in class sometimes. But then on the other hand, I think, well, so I'll give an example, and this student has graduated a long time ago, and she said it publicly, so I feel that it's okay for me to say it publicly. So I had a student in class once, a white female student, and we were talking about the difference between a recruitment problem in diversity and a retention problem in diversity. So in my mind, both issues are serious, but the more serious issue is the retention issue. So if you get somebody here that is a person who is of color or, LGBT or whatever the case may be, and they leave after having been here, that says a lot to me. And so we were talking about retention problems, and this one girl raised her hand in the class and said, well, you know, I hate to play devil's advocate here, but yeah, she didn't seem to hate it that much. I hate to play devil's advocate here, but this is if you look at who's here and who would most likely be attracted to this school, it would be white Catholic people. And so if you get here and you feel uncomfortable because that culture doesn't resonate with you, you should have known that to begin with. Yeah. And so I kind of had to, like, take a second. Yeah, I kind of had to just take a second and say, okay, if it's the case that white and Catholic should tell somebody something about a culture that they should be aware of, what is it that you think it should be that it's telling them? What is it that you think it should be telling them that they should then know to avoid it, right? And are you okay as a white Catholic person with that definition of white Catholicism if it should be a warning sign to people of color? And so she cried, and I wasn't mean about it. I was just saying that, and so, but it's interesting because I feel like she's probably said that a lot of times before, and no one's given her pushback, and that's why she cried this time. Was like, well, I've said it before to people on campus, and they seem to agree with me. So I'm going to say it again. Oh, people don't like that all of a sudden? And so that, to me, in a way, like, in some ways, I wish that we could, like, screen people out that would say things like that. In another way, it's an interesting challenge to be able to connect with people, because I do feel that over the course of the semester, this student made some forward progress. The watershed moment was, I guess, some form of progress. But yeah, I think that there are two things, right? Like, I'm happy to see that people are engaging in protests. I'm concerned about what we do about other students who are so defensive or quiet, don't say anything outwardly, but think that the protests are ridiculous, or that's my concern, and I don't know what we do about like moving that glacier. So anyway, I don't have an answer for it. It's just something that I've noticed that frustrates me.
Now I'd like to open it up for any questions from the audience.
I just want to thank you guys for coming tonight. I have like a couple, so I'm just gonna go ahead and do this now. So, what you just said. So I think that I don't know if you like agree with this or not, but this student that you had, I think part of the things that I've noticed since being at Villanova is that a lot of people think the way that this student might have thought, but they don't speak out for it. And this relates to my second question as well, is that why do you think some people are reluctant to like admit, and this is for like all three of you, to admit of having these thoughts, and then on the other side, why some people are reluctant to admit that a problem does exist. That's in relation to what you were speaking about earlier.
Oh, we didn't
Social desirability bias? Part of it for sure is, it's not socially desirable to say out loud like that I have these biases, right? We're living in an era where we need to be politically correct all the time for fear of not offending someone. So I think you have some people that are not going to speak out or speak their true thoughts for fear of what other people might think of them once they reveal their true thoughts, which is why when we're doing different kinds of methodologies, we try to do like implicit kinds of studies so we can get at people's true racial biases that might not be like revealing your explicit attitudes. If I ask you like, how do you feel about Black people? Like, when I give you the scale of stereotypes, like on a scale of 1 to 7, like, do you think that African Americans are lazy or trustworthy, intelligent? What about whites? What about Hispanics? Some of these questions that are asked on these national surveys, right? So the idea is that you might not want to reveal your true preferences because that person that might be interviewing you is judging you. But I think that's the same. The same is true in the real world. So like when you're sitting in the classroom and you're having these conversations, I think a lot of students are like, well, I agree with that person, but I'm not going to say it because I don't want anybody, giving me any crap afterwards, or I don't want the professor, trying to change my mind about some of these things. So I think that's definitely part of it. I also think, people just don't recognize how real their implicit biases are and how strong they are. Right, so from the time literally that we're born, the cartoons we watch, the movies we see, all of our interactions are very heavily shaped. So when you're watching the news, or the example I give my kids when I'm explaining, implicit bias, is like when I say a word or a few words, there's an image that comes to your mind. So when I say something like violent crime, or when I say welfare, or when I say terrorism, or immigration, there are pictures and images that come immediately to your mind, whether or not you're willing to admit aloud what those pictures or images are. They are there, right? You have them stored in your memory, these associations that you have with words. How does that happen? A lot of times we're looking at things like the media, right? But still, there's a certain level of discomfort that I think people have with admitting their true attitudes or expressing them aloud, especially as it pertains to race, because I think in part there's a great fear of retaliation, or like people thinking I'm a bigot and not wanting to fit into that mold. But, how do we get past that? I don't know, like in my race class, I play Everyone's a Little Bit Racist from Avenue Q. We open up the discussion about prejudice, and so it's like, let's all just admit that we all have some prejudices, right? Every single person in this room has done something that might offend a group, whether that might be a gender, religious, or racial or ethnic group, right? Can we all admit that? Yes. Okay, right? And then we just kind of work from there, right? But I think you have to figure out ways to draw people in. I don't know that it's directly asking them some of the things that I also use in my classes, dealt with like Socrative exercises. So instead of having like clickers where you answer questions, it's just a web browser. So you can put a question like on the board and people respond to it. It's anonymous. So you actually don't even know who gave what answer, and you open up and you have a discussion about this. So why might people, feel this way? Not what you answered, but why might people, right? And just kind of making the environment very safe so that people feel like they can engage, because you can also see on this board that even if you did punch in something that might not be a popular opinion, there's other people in the classroom that feel the exact same way as you do, right? And that might give you a little bit more courage to talk about some of these issues that are a bit more difficult. So enough just me.
I think one of the things that is interesting, so I went here for undergrad. So one of the things that I think is interesting about that is that although it was a little while ago, it was not long enough ago that I think that things have made some sort of like crazy shift. And so I think while people want to be politically correct in class and in larger groups, etc., if you listen to what happens in homogeneous groups of drunk people, what people say and how people behave, things start to come out. And it, in my mind, is almost like a secret, like, hey, I can say this here and it's okay, because we all secretly think this. And so now that we're all drunk and together and no one else is listening, we're going to say it. And this is what I think happens when we look at these like frat culture things that are around race or gender. It's like this group of people who have sort of found friendship around a norm. And depending upon what that norm is, people like to exacerbate that norm when they're under a particular influence in a group where they think no one's around to listen. And that is what still scares me. That's the scary part about people monitoring themselves from a PC perspective, is that it seems like when I ask my students, like, oh, like bias, or no, none of us, we're not biased. No, I would never think that. I would never say that. But I know that that's not true. And I know it firsthand, having gone here, what kinds of conversations people think that just because you're white and you look a particular kind of way, that you're going to be okay with that conversation. And I had to have a lot of tough conversations as an undergraduate where I was like, I am very uncomfortable with what you just said. And I've left places and I've done, because I was assumed to be a safe person to talk about these things with. And so to me, I think that that's really still a big problem. And I think that it's one that the students recognize, but they wouldn't necessarily voice it out loud. And I don't even think that they all like it. I think that in many instances, people go along with things. So I had this is like kind of funny, but I had a guy who was like on the lacrosse team in my class before. And so he was in my psych of gender and sexuality class, and he got really into it. Like, he was really like into he was like, yeah, I see a lot of this stuff happening on my team. I see a lot of this, like he was really into the class. So I get this email from him at like 3 a.m. being like, I'm at a party and I know this is weird, but but here's the stuff from class that I'm noticing. And he went on to say like, so-and-so said this thing about so-and-so, and then someone made like a racist joke, and then someone, and all these like people, and he's like, there are no people of color here, like they're talking about the women in a particular kind of way, or whatever. And he was just going on about this party, and he's like, man, I used to go to these parties, and like, I would never have read the situation this way. Now all of a sudden I'm noticing like, this party's horrible. And it was like, while it was maybe like not his best decision to send me like a probably drunken email, I was happy though that at least, there's a possibility that people who are if we change how people who are at the center of these things think about it, and maybe he didn't say anything in the moment, but he said something to me, and maybe that's the first step towards making progress to saying something when you're there. So I think the norm that people are clinging to has to change somehow. so that these displays of normativity don't gain people popularity or a sense of popularity or a fear that you won't be popular if you speak out against this kind of stuff that's, like, frankly unprofessional and inappropriate. But
yeah, I think you all pretty much covered it. I think that I just add by saying I think that it's a lot of the culture of politeness is, I think, kind of the less technical way of talking about social desirability. That I think that we've developed this culture of being polite, and I think that oftentimes I think we confuse that with I don't know if we confuse it with honesty, but I think we confuse it with being nice. We talk about Villanova, people are so nice here. And I think that people are polite, but I don't know if that's always nice. And so I think that there's a difference there. And I think that we need to think about how honesty also fits into that picture, that saying nothing is still saying something. And that we need to think about what it means when we say nothing. And that speaking up, I think, is a huge piece of changing the conversation and changing the norms that you all talked about.
Alda, do you have another question? Okay. Anybody else?
So, this is kind of related, but I feel like those of us who care about these issues tend to just talk to each other, and especially recently with the whole issue with Army Public Safety, I felt like we were all talking about it, and I got really excited, and then I realized that it was like, a couple hundred of us, and that's really big for Villanova, but it was the same couple hundred of us always talking to each other, and then I would talk to somebody else, and even though all of this stuff was going on campus, and all of this dialogue was happening, and, we actually had a protest, which, it's Villanova, and, like, all these things were happening, and the majority of the student body was still ignoring that it was happening. Not that they were actively opposed to it or in favor, but just ignoring that it was happening. So I guess what I'm trying to figure out is, how do we acknowledge that we have a problem and then try and reach other people to try and, as a community, acknowledge that we have a problem, not just have kind of a few of us in our corner really fighting for it.
So I think one way is thinking about, certainly having conversations and being intentional about having conversations with people who have different perspectives than your own. And so I think it's easy for us to go into, the groups that we're used to, hang out with the same friends and, go to our same organizations. But challenge yourself to go to an organization meeting that you wouldn't ordinarily go to, and literally ask why, and engage in conversation. And you don't necessarily go to try to be an antagonist and, rile people up, but say, I'm really, if I'm coming here, I really want to understand, why I don't understand, I don't agree, I don't see that perspective. Can you explain it to me? Because I just don't get it. And I think that that's where we have, conversations that can really push us. I think particularly in today's day and age, so much of the information that we get is filtered. If we think about, your Facebook feed or your Twitter feed, it's all filtered. It's not a spectrum of what's happening in the world. There's all these algorithms that are constantly working. The ads that we're getting, all those things. And our news sources are filtered, even if you turn on the television, the news sources are still filtered in that ways. We have the, kind of unofficially or officially labeled conservative stations, and we have the liberal stations, and then we have a couple, I don't even know if I would consider anything in between. Maybe a little less extreme, but not a lot really in between that's covering both. And so I think that, even watching news stations that aren't your preferred type of news source, I think gives you a lot of information about what another perspective is, and gives you tools to engage in the conversation, because it's uncomfortable. It is definitely uncomfortable to walk in a room and people are like, I know they hate me, or I know I'm the only one who disagrees with this perspective. But the more we practice putting ourselves in these difficult situations, the easier it becomes, and the more conversant we become with these kinds of conversations and asking the questions. And the other thing I think is think about what you are a part of that maybe is one of sort of the mainstream things. So one example I can give is that Devon Jackson and I were asked to do a workshop for the new ambassadors that had come up. And so one of the things we were talking about, we did some case studies, and one of the things that we had them think about is, so which is different than if they were actually like low-key and giving tours, but really engaging in this situation. So I think one of the situations we gave was, say you have a parent who has said they've heard about Villanova becoming armed and sworn. How do you respond? Do you engage in that conversation? Do you not engage? And how do you respond? And so thinking about how you practice those types of responses, one, and then two, what kinds of opportunities do you have as students to present or to talk to a group of folks who maybe there are some people who are in your group of couple hundred who you have these conversations with, but maybe there's a whole bunch of other people who aren't a part of that couple hundred. How can you at least, give a drop of information to that particular group? I mean, kind of giving off that same example, it was just so interesting as we've been standing on the ellipse every Friday from 12 to 12:30. Come if you want to, still continue to stand against violence in 4Ps. And it was just really fascinating to watch the tours that go on during that time frame. And especially in the early weeks, people would the tour guides would look away and then talk about everything that Doherty is in Doherty Hall and ignore that anything was happening there. Now, one day we had that happen again, and then afterwards there was a group that was on campus visiting, and it was a largely Latino group. I think it was a Latino recruiting program in particular. And there was a student who I know who was kind of guiding the students, and I think was walking them from somewhere in Doherty to somewhere else on campus, and stopped by, came up onto the ellipse, and talked in whispered tones to the students and said, so these are some faculty and students, and here's what's going on. And so regardless of if you agree or disagree, here's a venue or here's a place and a way in which we can have our voices heard. And stood there silently observing with the students and kind of gave an acknowledgement and kept going. How different of a way is that of dealing with a particular situation? It's difficult and you might not necessarily know what to say, but we cannot avoid. We cannot lead by avoidance. We have to engage. And figuring out the ways in which we can engage in those ways makes a world of difference.
I also think it's important to recognize, and this is not an out for students that feel the kinds of ways that we've been talking about, but it has been my experience as an undergraduate here, and also continues to be my experience with students, that a lot of people have very strong political beliefs within their families. And so it is a battle sometimes for students to come to campus and their families have told them something their entire life, and now you're telling them something different, and then maybe they go home for break and they say that whatever something different is that you said, and the parents are like, no, that's dumb, that's not true, your professors are brainwashing you or whatever. And so it's interesting because, so I took Bob DeFina's poverty class. I don't know if any of you know Bob DeFina, but I took his poverty class when I was like a sophomore. And I loved that class. And it gave me a lot of language to talk about things that I heard going on in my family that I didn't like, but I couldn't argue with because I just didn't have anything to argue, like I didn't have any knowledge to argue with. So I remember, like I came home from break and I was like, when people in our family talk about, like, if people of color move onto our block and we say we want to move, like, that's called white flight. And that's what you guys are doing. And I had this, like, language for it. And my parents were like, no, that's stupid. That's not what's happening. This is what's happening. They had this other kind of thing that they wanted to talk about. And so I went back to Bob and I was like, I went home and my parents were, like, super, like, they didn't like what I was talking about. They were like, can you help me be better at, like, conveying this? And he was like, yeah. Just use the articles that we have in class and like cite stuff and talk about the studies and whatever. And I was like, oh yeah, I guess I could do that. So one of the things, so then I like actually had studies and I was like, well, this study was like, where's your study? And I was like really serious about it. But like, I think one of the things that I teach my students to do that I've done because of that is like the first lesson that we do in psychogender and sexuality is how do we learn and how do we seize on information and how do we know if information is good? How do we evaluate sources of information? So we go through a whole long process of learning about that because if all the sources of information that you're being told are either just opinions or stuff that you heard from your grandpa or, you know, or something that people got from some report that's unfounded, then you know that what you know is not really something anymore. So I'm going to give you stuff that I know because I've really vetted it and I believe in it. And if you want to bring stuff that's good to me that gives another approach, we can talk about that. But now you know how to evaluate stuff. So if you push the people who taught you this stuff and they don't have stuff, I got stuff. If you don't have stuff on the other, you know, like, what does that tell you, right? So, so that's been something useful, I think, for the students to kind of realize that, like, oh, I don't really know a lot about this. And that's helpful, I think. I don't know.
Great. Well, thank you so much for coming. This was really informative, and I think everyone really enjoyed this. And I'm sure Dr. Kato will probably watch this video, so shout out to him. So thanks for coming, everyone.